Hey guys, tonight we begin how people avoided pregnancy in medieval Iran. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the light, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So Uvea begin. Not in a palace or a battlefield, but in a slow, smoky room off an alleyway in the city of Ray, sometime in the early 11th century. Ray, just south of modern-day Tehran, was one of the largest and most important cities in medieval Iran, a center of commerce and science, thick with mosques, libraries, and herbalist stalls. But beyond its famous scholars and traders, it was also full of women who didn't want to be pregnant. And it's here, in a quiet corner of the city, that you'd find a woman named Fa'ima, sitting cross-legged with a folded linen ledger. In her lap, she was a midwife. Not a physician. Those roles were almost exclusively reserved for men in official circles. But like many midwives at the time, she held a repository of local wisdom, too subtle or too female to be written in the courtly Arabic of scholars. She tracked herbs, whispered advice, and managed the messy arithmetic of birth and non-birth. Fa'ima's ledger was made from reused cotton and goatskin, and though it held no magical symbols or mysterious runes, its contents were still considered suspect by many. Inside, written in Persian and Arabic scripts, were lists of herbs, days of the month, bodily temperatures, the wetness or dryness of a woman's complexion, and her mood after intercourse. Because, according to the Galenic system of medicine, still prevalent in the Islamic world at the time, pregnancy didn't just depend on an act, it depended on temperament. Medieval Islamic medicine, inherited in large part from Greek and Roman traditions, was rooted in the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each had its own quality: hot, cold, wet, or dry. And each person's body was seen as a balance or imbalance of these. Conception, too, was understood through this lens. To prevent it, Fa'ima might advise a cooling herb. If a woman was too hot, or drying foods if she was too wet. She might discourage intercourse during specific moon phases, or prescribe mustard oil to be applied before intimacy. Not to kill sperm, but to weaken the internal warmth that allowed conception to take place. None of this felt strange, or secret in her world. It was merely daily life. In the marketplaces of Ray, it wasn't uncommon to hear the whispers of women over bundles of dried rue, pomegranate peels, or crushed myrtle leaves. These were among the more widely used substances for those hoping to avoid pregnancy, soaked, steeped, powdered, or mixed into suppositories or douches. The process was rarely discussed openly, but the coded language was understood. Good. For a dry womb or makes the blood sleep were common ways of signaling such intentions. Some recipes were passed down like family heirlooms. One surviving example from the Persian physician Zayn al-Din al-Jurjung, practiced later in the 12th century, includes ingredients like cypress roots, rue, and galls, boiled in vinegar, and inserted into the vagina after intercourse. These concoctions weren't created with the exact understanding of how conception occurred, but they reflected a detailed empirical awareness of bodily reactions. Indeed, for many, the goal wasn't to prevent fertilization, an idea that would have made little sense at the time, but to prevent the womb from retaining seed. This was believed to be as much a psychological and spiritual state as it was physical. A frightened, sick, or angry woman might be unable to conceive because her body was too disturbed. Likewise, a woman who bathed in cold water immediately after sex, or who jumped repeatedly afterward, a recommended technique was thought to shake loose the seed. But none of this was foolproof. So much of a midwife's work also involved calculations. When was the woman's last menstrual cycle? Was her complexion pallid or flushed after intercourse? Did she experience nausea or a heaviness in her lower belly? Was she dreaming of fire or water symbols often associated with fertility and heat? Fa'ima, like many others, did not see herself as preventing life, but regulating it. Life in this worldview was something constantly on the verge of happening. It was a river always pressing against the banks. Her job was simply to guide its flow, to divert it when needed, and to stop it from overflowing in a household already full, or in a marriage too newly formed, or for a servant girl with no dowry. No one ever asked her to explain this. Logic didn't need explaining. It was simply how things worked. The actual act of avoiding pregnancy was rarely discussed by men. Even in the preserved texts of the great physicians like Avicenna, Ibn Sina, who lived in this very region, and Era, there is little overt discussion of contraception. When mentioned, it was framed within broader discussions of gynecology or fertility management. Avicenna's canon of medicine mentions that intercourse too soon after menstruation was less likely to result in pregnancy. Not because of ovulation, which was not yet understood, but because the womb had not yet recovered its heat. Yet within homes and alleyways, among midwives and herbal vendors, a different, quieter tradition thrived. It was not written in books, but encoded in routines, the teas brewed only on certain nights, the sudden fasting, the baths taken in the cold river, and the act of sleeping in separate rooms for a full moon cycle. These weren't necessarily effective by modern standards, but they weren't meant for us. They belonged to a different logic, one that tried to tame the unpredictable nature of the female body, using everything from timing and temperature to vinegar and prayer. But of course, there was always the question of what to do when those methods failed, when the womb refused to release, when morning sickness came anyway. Fatima had a list for that too, but its use was far more dangerous and far more taboo. What, then, happened when prevention wasn't enough? What lines could a woman cross, and which were too perilous, even in private? You return now to Phi Yema's cramped workspace, the cloth ledger still folded shut beside a worn mortar and pestle. Outside, the call to prayer echoes from the distant minaret, but inside, the air is heavy with dried rue and fennel, and the silence is deeper than ritual. A girl sits across from her, barely 17, cheeks sunken not from illness but from tension. Her eyes do not look up. Her fingers twist the cord of her headscarf, and her breath is shallow. She is not the first to come this way. In medieval Iran, to be pregnant at the wrong time, too soon in a marriage, too late in life, or outside the accepted boundaries of wedlock, was not simply a private matter. It could be a disaster, not necessarily because of law, though that too, but because of expectation. Women were expected to conceive in accordance with their social station, their age, and their marriage contract. Failure to align these could result in shame, exile from the household, or worse. And so, midwives like I found themselves operating in a quiet dual role, guardians of fertility and, in the most hidden corners, guides for when the seed should not remain. This work was dangerous not only medically but socially. There were no formal punishments listed for providing abortive remedies in the Islamic legal manuals of the time, but neither were such actions condoned if the pregnancy was far advanced. Scholars debated the exact point at which life entered the fetus. Some said 40 days, others 120. What mattered, practically speaking, was that the earlier it was done, the more likely it would be ignored. But what if a woman were to die in the process? Or what if the attempt were discovered? The consequences were severe, and yet the need remained. Fahima's ledger contained two kinds of recipes, those for gentle discouragement, and those for what she quietly called cleansing. Among the latter were combinations still found in surviving Persian medical manuscripts, mixed with bitter orange peel and vinegar, soaked cotton swabs infused with asafoetida, or dried camel thorn boiled into an astringent tea. These were not exact or guaranteed. Some were intended to induce strong menstruation. Others worked in theory by irritating the womb or heating the blood until it rejected the embryo. One of the most potent ingredients was harmal, or Syrian rua seed, known for its psychoactive and abortifacient properties. Our midwives would grind it and burn it as incense or brew it in tea with dried mint and crushed pomegranate bark, but it was volatile. Too strong a dose could cause violent cramps, hemorrhaging, or permanent sterility. Too little, and the effort would fail. There was also a widely known, if quietly spoken, Method involving castor oil and heat. After administering a strong purgative, the woman would be wrapped in thick linens, laid near a hot hearth, and fed cumin spiced broth until she began to sweat. The theory, based again in humoral logic, was that excess heat would drive out the retained blood and unwelcome seed. This method, risky and painful, was used only when other options had failed. When time was running out, in many cases, it was not the physical technique but the ritual that gave comfort. Women would recite certain Quranic verses, drink from blessed vessels, or wear talismans inscribed with protective phrases while undergoing these treatments. Some midwives even employed sleep charms, perfumed sachets tucked under the pillow to calm the womb and lighten the dream. As one phrase from a 12th century commentary puts it. Still, not every case ended well. In the small court records of the Qazvin region, just west of Ray, a 1090 entry survives regarding a young servant girl named Hajar, who was found unconscious in the servant quarters of her master's home. The entry does not detail the cause, only that a midwife had been summoned but arrived too late. The language is restrained, but the implication is clear. She had taken something. And though her name appeared only once in the ledger, local accounts suggest she was not the last. It's worth pausing here to understand just how little power women held in such moments. Even those who wished to avoid pregnancy had few tools. And almost no formal authority, they navigated a maze of expectations. To be fertile but not too soon. To conceive but only within a stable home. To protect the honor of the family, but without control over the circumstances of their intimacy. What little power they had was wielded through their knowledge of the body, its rhythms, temperatures, and tolerances. Midwives existed in the narrow space between acceptance and suspicion. Their knowledge was useful, even life-saving, but their autonomy made them targets of gossip. Some were believed to know magic, others were accused of fostering promiscuity. Few, especially those who dealt in abortifacients, were feared outright. Fa'ima had learnt to speak carefully, to refuse certain questions, and to keep her ledger folded shut unless alone. This secrecy extended even to family members. Daughters rarely told their mothers, and wives often acted without their husband's knowledge. In some rare cases, a sister or aunt might serve as an intermediary, but the circle remained small. And all of this was done without the benefit of anatomical understanding. There were no diagrams of ovaries, no awareness of ovulation cycles. The uterus, in medical texts, was often drawn as a collection of small chambers, sometimes described as being pulled around the body by emotional distress. Treatments were based not on fertilization, but on observable symptoms, missed periods, changes in appetite, bloating, or dreams of water and snake symbols of life and its unsettling arrival. In such a world, the line between prevention and termination was often thin. Timing mattered. Language mattered more. Even the terms used were deliberately vague. A woman might ask for something to cleanse the body, to restore balance, or to lighten the blood. Only midwives understood what was truly meant, and even they sometimes had to guess. The girl sitting before Fa'ima Naushi had come with the same request, in those same words. Fa'ima had offered her rue and vinegar compresses, had whispered a prayer over a dish of lentils, and had told her to avoid warmth for 3 days and to sleep alone. But now the girl had returned. The blood had not come. What would Fa'ima do next? Would she risk the stronger herbs, knowing the cost? Or would she wait longer, hoping for a natural end, even if the signs were not promising? The choice weighed more heavily than any entry in her ledger. And yet it was a choice that midwives in medieval Iran faced again and again in secret, in silence, and in the stillest hours of night. And so you return again, for the last time, to that small room in Ray. The herbs have been swept into their jars. The girl is gone, her scarf left folded neatly on the bench. Quiet thank you. Or perhaps a confession of worry. The evening light has grown longer, and the ledger, once held tightly in Fa'ima's lap, now rests open on the mat before her. She doesn't write, but she stares down at its pages, as if the act of remembering might keep the words from fading. This was the nature of her work. It's never acknowledged, always necessary. The girl had returned again 2 weeks later, pale, frightened, still unwell. The herbs had not worked. The bleeding had not come. This time she had brought coin. A small silver dirham tucked inside her sleeve. It was more than most women could offer, and it was a sign. She was ready for something stronger. Fatima knew the signs. Well, she also knew the risk. Syrian rue, myrtle oil, and a tea of coriander seed boiled in vinegar. This was the combination she chose. Not the most dangerous, but far from the mildest. The girl was instructed to drink, rest, sweat, and wait. Fatima wrapped her in wool and laid a cool stone under her pillow to draw the heat downward, as the older women used to say. It was not science, not in the modern sense, but it was care. Measured, deliberate care. The knowledge was empirical, developed through generations. Of trial and error, it wasn't passed down through universities, but through the rhythms of life itself, births witnessed. Bleeding managed, secrets kept. The girl did bleed eventually. She returned again after 3 days, steadier on her feet. Her voice returned. To her, she said little. Fatima said less. There was no celebration. There never was. But the unspoken language of survival had played itself out again, this time without tragedy. And yet even in that small success, Fatima knew the danger remained. She could be accused, even without proof. All it would take was a whisper, an enemy, or a jealous rival midwife. In many cities, even those under Islamic law, suspicion alone could lead to expulsion from the community, or worse. The fact that she kept written records, however vague, was itself a risk. But she did not trust her memory alone. Was her protection and her legacy. It held recipes, but more than that, it held patterns. What herbs worked best in spring? Which women responded poorly to rue? How many days a certain treatment took? How long to wait before trying something stronger? She wrote not to teach others, but to remind herself that the knowledge mattered, that these small details, though dismissed by men in white robes and scholars with titles, were the true thread of life for the women of her world. What makes this ledger so remarkable is not that it was preserved in deed. It likely wasn't. We don't have her actual book. We only imagine it, built from scattered medical treatises, from dusty marginalia in herbals, from obscure references in travelers' journals and court records. But we know she existed, or women like her did. Because history leaves traces, not always names, but routines. You see these traces in the Canon of Medicine by Avicenna, where certain contraceptives are listed briefly, almost reluctantly, under gynecological ailments. You see them in the writings of Al-Razi and Jurjani, who, though male physicians, recorded female practices they did not fully understand. You see them in the poems of Persian women who speak of barren wombs not as curses, but as freedoms. And you see them faintly in the folk traditions that still linger today in rural parts of Iran, Afghanistan, and Central Asia, where rue is still burnt, where vinegar is still whispered over, and where midwives still carry bundles of herbs. Wrapped in cloth, the knowledge did not die. But it did change. Over the centuries, as Islamic medical knowledge merged with European science and colonial influence, traditional midwifery lost prestige. Formal obstetrics rose in male-dominated academic settings, and the old herbal methods were dismissed as superstition. The language of humors gave way to that of cells and hormones. In some ways, this was progress. But something was also lost. The modern world often sees historical methods of pregnancy prevention as quaint, ineffective, or dangerous, and many were. But they were also acts of deep personal agency, of women working within the boundaries of what was available to them, shaping their lives with what little control they had. These acts were not loud. They were not political. They were personal, quiet, often painful, and always meaningful. Think of the girl in Fi's room not as a symbol, but as a person. She would go on to marry, perhaps or perhaps not. She may have had children later, or remain childless. Her story was likely never written, but in that moment, she chose. And someone helped her choose. That quiet resistance, that ability to say, not now, even in a time when almost nothing else could be chosen, that is the thread we follow. Even the scholars, distant as they were, noted the persistence of these practices. In a 12th century commentary on Galenic medicine, a Persian scribe scrawled in the margin, "Women always know. More than they say, it's a simple line, but it tells you everything." Today, historians of medicine, those who dig through old pharmacopoeias and who translate Arabic manuscripts on gynecology, often find footnotes describing female contraceptive knowledge as a curiosity. But what if it wasn't a curiosity? What if it was the core? What if, for centuries, women in medieval Iran wove a parallel history, unendorsed but essential, a history of wombs managed, of pregnancies prevented, of lives shaped not by kings or wars, but by timing, temperature, and the bitter root of the rue plant? You want to find 5 UMA's name in the archives? Her ledger, if it ever existed, has likely turned to dust. But her logic, her timing, her careful dosage of herbs, that legacy lives on. Not in textbooks, but in the daily lives of those who kept their own rhythms, who watched the moon, who listened to their bodies when no one else would. And so when we ask, how did people avoid pregnancy in medieval Iran? The answer is not one method or one moment. It is a patchwork of quiet efforts, a whisper in the marketplace, a folded scarf on a bench, recipe passed from hand to hand, a choice made behind a shuttered door. It is, in the end, the history of survival. Sometimes, the only record that remains is a smudge of ink in the corner of a forgotten page. You now find yourself far from Ray. The streets of Nishapur were once a bustling center of Persian science. Literature and commerce stretch in every direction like the pattern of a well-woven carpet. The year is somewhere around 1020 CE, and the city hums with the low clatter of cartwheels, the creak of olive oil presses, and the rustle of parchment in the hands of scholars. Here, in the tiled shade of a stone apothecary near the city's central bazaar, works a man named Yusuf ibn Makan. Yusuf is not a physician, not in the grand way that someone like Avicenna is. He hasn't written treatises or taught in Baghdad, doesn't wear robes stitched with gold or sit in the circle of emirs. He is, more simply, an AR, a pharmacist trained in the practical arts of compounding and dispensing medicine. But his knowledge is no less profound for being unspectacular. It is measured in scales of rue seeds, in the scratch of reed pens over daily purchase ledgers, and in the careful folding of parchment around powders meant to ease pain, spark desire, or sometimes to prevent it. Among the drawers of Yusuf's modest shop are tiny wooden compartments marked in Persian and Arabic nabbed KHM, raw sugar, Samalefer, rat poison, rarely requested, and Zari, high life's poison, term often used for contraceptive compounds. It is that final drawer, the one furthest from the window and least spoken of, that holds our interest. Medieval Iranian medicine inherited much from Greek and Indian traditions. Physicians Abibis classified contraceptives into several categories. Agents that killed the seed coddle all many. Ow! Prevented retention man AML, or cooled the womb. Most respected of them, like Avicenna and Al-Arzi, recorded dozens of such remedies in their works. But those were distant books. In cities like Nishapur, it was the pharmacist's quiet figures like Yusuf who made these substances real. He learned his craft from his father, who had studied under an Nestorian Christian herbalist. Knowledge here flowed without concern for religion or creed. What mattered was accuracy. If the rue was too dry, it would not work. If the myrtle was not ground finely enough, it would cause pain. If the pomegranate peel was too bitter, the woman might not drink it. Yusuf didn't always know how his compounds were used. Clients came quietly. A husband might request something to keep his wife balanced. A midwife might request powdered dry fig and alum for a girl who bleeds strangely. But the pattern was there. Some women came more often. Always in the days after marriage, never with children in tow. One woman, a regular, once told him, "I only need to sleep peacefully this year. My husband leaves often for Kazvin." She said no more. She didn't need to. Yusuf's shelf of contraceptive ingredients was narrow but precise. There were dried cypress cones, sometimes ground with saffron and vinegar. There was calcifa, Syrian root, used to induce menstruation. Old bundles of marjoram believed to lighten the womb. He also kept alum powder, which, when inserted in cotton plugs, was said to tighten and cool the interior of the body, making it hostile to conception. He never advertised these things. There were no signs for them. But they were asked. For all the same. Even the great Avicenna, whose canon of medicine was already circulating in manuscript copies by Yusuf's time, noted several contraceptive options under the section on female health. But he rarely dwelled on them. His emphasis was balance. The body is a system, not a machine. He described how a womb could be too cold or too moist, how the seed might fail to settle, and how intercourse performed out of season would fail to produce life. Pregnancy was not merely about sperm and egg ideas unknown at the time, but about environment, rhythm, and vitality. Yusuf had read some of these works. He kept an incomplete copy of the canon beneath his workbench, along with a tattered book of Indian plant medicines translated into Arabic. But his wisdom came mostly from hands-on observation. He'd seen which women returned with complaints, and which ones didn't. He'd watched which recipes were reordered, and which ones came back torn up and cursed. There were patterns to be noticed. Women with warm, ruddy complexions seemed to prefer vinegar-based preparations. Women who complained of sluggishness and phlegm responded better to warming herb cinnamon, asafoetida, and a touch of clove. And then there were those who wanted more than just prevention. Some clients, though rare, asked for maffa-teethed openers. These were treatments meant to induce menstruation that had not come, especially when the delay was suspicious. They were controversial. Some texts advised against them. Others warned of uterine damage or divine punishment. Yusuf, like many pharmacists, simply labeled them as for late blood. What people did with them, he did not ask. But behind the quiet exchange of powders and liquids lay a very real tension. Contraception, while present in the Islamic world, was never fully embraced nor fully condemned. Coitus interruptus azul was debated in legal circles. Some schools of thought permitted it with the wife's consent. Others discouraged it, claiming it wasted the seed seen by some as a potential soul. But women's methods, the use of herbs, cotton plugs, and douches, were not often discussed in public. They were allowed to exist in a shadow zone, tolerated if quiet, dangerous if exposed. This meant that Yusuf, despite his education and skill, had to tread carefully. Too many requests for rue might draw attention, as too many whispered prescriptions could lead to accusations. The city's mutasib, or market inspector, was known to fine apothecaries who sold immoral goods. Though the definition was left intentionally vague, still the requests came, and Yusuf obliged. In the cool of the evening, after the shop had closed, he would sometimes copy down new recipes, not just for himself, but for his apprentice, a thin boy with bright eyes named Hab. The boy asked no questions but watched intently. One night Yusuf handed him a folded page with the heading substances that prevent the lodging of seed. The list was short. Myrtle oil, infused with mint alum and powdered rue, pomegranate peel soaked in vinegar. A decoction of lentil water with dried fig cotton dipped in lemon juice and inserted before intercourse. He did not explain. He didn't need to. These were not miracles. They did not always work. But they gave women a sliver of control in a world that offered little. As the city of Nishapur prepared for another spring, Yusuf noticed the same patterns repeating. A surge in rue sales, an uptick in alum, the return of the midwife with the crooked tooth. He made his notes, adjusted his balances, and carried on. Because the real art of medieval contraception in Iran was not in the ingredients, but in the silence around them, the ability to act without speaking, to choose without declaring, to manage life's greatest power creation without ever being seen to challenge it. But how much of this knowledge, Yusuf wondered, would survive? His apprentice was learning, but what of the rest? The women who left no records, the pharmacists who refused to pass on the recipes, the scrolls that would burn in the coming Mongol invasion. Could knowledge built in whispers survive the roar of history? The dust in Yusuf's shop never fully settled. It lived between the parchment folds, clung to the lip of his bronze scales, and crept into the threads of his long, ink-stained sleeves. But it also clung to something larger, the gap between what was written in books and what was done in practice. In his quieter hours, when the stream of customers had dwindled and the light filtered amber through the lattice window, Yusuf would open his incomplete copy of Avicenna's Canon of Medicine. It was not a cheap book. It had cost him the better part of 3 months' earnings, and the ink had faded in places. But the structure of its logic still shimmered through. Health is balance. The body is a vessel ruled by heat, cold, dryness, and moisture. He read, slowly and often aloud, the sections on gynecology, though the canon itself, like most great works of Islamic medicine, did not name contraception directly in those terms. It used phrases like man-al-GAML prevention of pregnancy, or tabias al-mani retention of seed, careful to place the burden of action not on an intent to avoid motherhood, but on a perceived imbalance or need for therapeutic regulation. Still, it was there, veiled, hinted at, but present. And this, too, revealed the unease of the time. The Islamic world of the 10th and 11th centuries inherited a tremendous legacy of learning. Galen's humoral theories were translated into Arabic, refined by scholars like Al-Arzi and Avicenna, and filtered into the great hospitals of cities like Baghdad and Shiraz. But medicine was more than science, it was also ethics, theology, and status. A physician was not merely expected to heal, but to serve the maglaka, the public good, as defined by both reason and divine law. Yes, and this is where contraception made many scholars uncomfortable. To prescribe contraceptives too openly could raise accusations. Was the physician encouraging vice, aiding in adultery, disrupting God's will? It was easier and safer to treat conception as a function of imbalance. If the womb was too cold, it could not retain the seed. If the seed was weak, it could not produce life. If the womb were overly moist, it would expel rather than nurture. This allowed physicians to prescribe treatments that had the effect of preventing pregnancy while never explicitly calling it so. Yusuf understood this game well. His customers never asked directly, and he never answered directly. A woman might say she felt heavy in the belly or troubled by warmth. A midwife might ask for a decoction to correct the bleeding. Everyone knew what was meant, and no one said it aloud. But the scholarly texts themselves told a more complex story. In Al-Rask Skitbay ALW, compiled in the 9th century, several recipes appear for the prevention of pregnancy under the guise of medical need. One, involving the insertion of vinegar-soaked cotton before intercourse, is noted as preserving balance and preventing the thickening of seed. Another mentions crushed mint, mustard seed, and alum. These entries are brief and always surrounded by caveats about moderation and medical necessity. Even Avicenna, careful as he was, allowed the listing of contraceptive substances under the wider category of mafatitht, openers, substances that opened the blocked pathways of the body. These included rue, wormwood, and pomegranate. Rindherbs already familiar to Yusuf but now granted legitimacy by their presence in the most respected medical texts of his time. But there were others who resisted. The scholar Al-Ghazalk, writing slightly later, warned against azal withdrawal and anything resembling interference with the divine process of creation. He allowed it within marriage only if the wife consented, and there was no risk of harm. But even then, he treated it as a spiritual compromise, not forbidden, but not ideal. And so the physician walked a narrow line, one foot in science, one in religion, both trying to keep balance. Yusuf had no interest in defying religion, prayed 5 times daily, fasted in Ramadan, and gave alms when he could. But he also saw with his own eyes the toll that unplanned pregnancies took on women, saw the exhaustion in the face of the seamstress who could not carry another child while still nursing too. He saw the fear in the merchant's young wife, who begged for 1 more year of peace. He saw the sorrow in the widowed daughter of the bookseller whose brief, secret marriage had left her with suspicion and morning sickness. These were not hypothetical cases in a physician's scroll. These were his neighbors. And while the scholars argued in the margins of manuscripts, life in the city pressed on with its own logic. The bathhouses were full of whispers. The markets saw quiet exchanges of myrtle and mugwort. Midwives, with their worn hands and calm gazes, continued to guide women through choices they were not supposed to have. And in the middle of it all stood the pharmacists, neither judge nor healer, but somewhere in between. They were the facilitators of that silent medical economy, one that didn't appear in textbooks but was written in the daily exchange of copper coins and soft-spoken requests. Yusuf knew he was not a revolutionary, didn't change the law or challenge the scholars, but he paid attention, recorded which combinations worked, which were tolerated, and which were safe enough to recommend again. And he passed this on not in books, but in careful instruction. His apprentice Hab now mixed powders with steady hands. He knew to measure twice, to taste the vinegar for strength, and to smell the rue for freshness. He asked once, while folding a sachet of alum and crushed fenugreek, "Is this for bleeding or for waiting?" Yusuf had smiled. "It depends on how she uses it." Because that was the secret. The pharmacist did not determine meaning. The woman did. The same herb might ease pain, induce a period, or prevent a pregnancy. The same tea might be brewed for health or for control. It all came down to intent. And intent, Neil, was a sacred concept. It's not just in medicine, but in religion. Yusuf liked to think that what he offered was not interference, but knowledge. It's a way for women to understand their own rhythms, to work with the laws of nature rather than against them. He believed, as Avicenna had written, that health is not simply the absence of illness, but the harmony of all parts. And sometimes that harmony required pause. Not prevention in the modern sense, but intermission, a chance to rest. Prepare to choose. Still, there were days when he wondered what the mutasib would say if he found the list tucked beneath his bench, or what a jurist might declare if a woman's miscarriage was traced back to a compound sold from this very shop. The line remained narrow, shifting, always negotiated. But the women kept coming. They came with scarves drawn low, with questions half-spoken, with coins pressed into calloused palms. They came for relief, for control, for silence. They came, not because Yusuf was famous or powerful, but because he listened. And he offered what medicine often forgets to offer, understanding without judgment. Yet even as he filled another packet of rue and vinegar, he couldn't help but ask himself, if the great physicians could only whisper about this knowledge, who would protect it when the whispering stopped? The rains came late to Nishaper that year, and when they finally arrived, they seemed to soak into the alleys with a weary, bone-deep hush. It was the kind of rain that softened rooftops and quieted the marketplaces. The kind of rain that wrapped around the city like an old shawl knot, unwelcome but heavy with memory. Yusuf's shop, lined with drying herbs and sealed jars of powdered resins, seemed to breathe with the moisture. The scent of myrtle, vinegar, and wet parchment mingled into something both sour and sweet. For most, this was a slow time. But for Yusuf, it was a season of stories. In the gray hours after the last customer had gone, he often sat near the hearth with Hab, his apprentice, and talked not of formulas, not of ratios or measures, but of people. Not every pharmacological truth could be weighed with scales. "Do you remember Fatima bint Al?" Nakash Yusuf would begin. Ab, still not 20, would nod. "The widow who asked for juju bark and crushed pomegranate peel, but didn't say why?" "She didn't have to," Yusuf said. "Her eyes said it." She had buried 2 infants already. This was not an act of rebellion. It was survival. The longer Yusuf practiced, the more he came to understand that the real archive of contraceptive knowledge was not the bookcase in his shop, but the invisible library carried in the heads and hands of women. They preserved what was too delicate, too dangerous to write down. There had once been a woman named Bee Bashraf, who visited his shop every Thursday before sunset. She wore thick wool in summer and winter alike, her sandals patched with rope. No one knew where she lived. Some said she had once been a wet nurse in the eastern caravanserai. Others said she was the daughter of an herbalist from Bukhara. She never asked for the same thing twice. crushed tamarind, boiled dill seed, anemone roots scraped from clay pots. But every mixture had a purpose. And every visit was followed a week later by a woman ever the same one twice who left with red eyes and quiet thanks. Eventually, Yusuf understood. Bibi Ashraf was a living index of remedies, a walking collection of footnotes no man had ever written. She wasn't a midwife exactly, nor a healer in any official sense. She was part of a parallel world, one in which women passed knowledge like others passed recipes for soup or bread. That knowledge had structure. Rue was never mixed with honey, it clashed. Myrtle had to be steeped 3 times. Lum could burn if applied too soon. Vinegar must never be heated in a copper pot. Every detail mattered and none of it had a page. Number. Yusuf once asked her why she didn't write it down. She'd laughed a quiet, almost pitying laugh. "Do you write your mother's lullaby?" she asked. "You just sing it, remember?" That memory was passed not through ink, but through repetition. It's through hands touching the same ingredients week after week, through a midwife whispering instructions during a cold dawn bath, and through an older sister spooning a tea into a younger. One's mouth without explanation, and this memory, this oral lineage of care and control, became vital in a world where written medicine was increasingly dominated by men, and where the power to name often meant the power to erase. For all their brilliance, scholars like Avicenna, Al-Arzi, and even Hippocrates rarely cited women as authorities. Their texts were systems, not stories. They prized classification over conversation. But the herbal contraceptives used across Nishapur did not emerge from theory, they emerged from necessity. Women did not need to know the Greek term for a menagogue to know which herb made the blood return. They did not need to debate whether fertility was governed by cold, phlegm, or warm. Collar to notice that eating too many dates or too much garlic changed the body's cycles. It was knowledge born of observation, of trial and error, of risk and resolve, and that made it fragile. Yusuf had seen firsthand how easily this memory could fade. When a midwife died without a student, when a daughter married far and forgot, when the markets changed and one key herb disappeared, and worst of all, when the fear grew, fear that the practice itself was sinful, fear that to speak openly was to invite judgment, fear that memory might be mistaken for poison, and the woman who remembered it called a witch. And yet the knowledge persisted quietly like the rain. In the hush of hammams, in the folds of travel scarves, in jars without labels, Yusuf felt the weight of this. He was a man, after all, walking in a space shaped by women. There were limits to what he could understand, and even more limits to what he was permitted to ask. He never entered a bathhouse. He never attended a birth. He did not know the exact prayers whispered during certain teas, nor the full set of taboos observed when brewing a particularly strong decoction. But he had something else. He had a ledger. Not a formal one, not the shop's accounts, but a notebook tucked in a drawer, written in coded words and symbols, where he quietly recorded patterns. Infusion A used before cycle. Seemed effective. Turned after 30 days. Not pregnant. Or powder C too bitter, caused vomiting. Do not repeat. It was not a textbook, but it was a start. And more than once he wondered if this quiet science, this bridge between what was known and what was lived, might someday vanish. Already, new scholars were emerging who dismissed the old remedies. They sought cleaner theories, purer substances, and universal categories. They wanted medicine without ambiguity, without folklore, without contradiction. But people were not pure. Their lives did not follow clean lines. The woman who asked for a contraceptive one month might come the next month seeking a fertility remedy. The same tea could be a tonic in one village and a taboo in the next. Truth was slippery, alive, adapted to the soil and season and spirit, and this is what made it worth preserving. On one particularly rainy afternoon, when the shop was quiet and the mortar was cooling, Hab asked a question Yusuf had long been expecting. Should we ever write them down? The real recipes? All of them. Yusuf stirred the embers in the brazier before answering. Would it help the women? Hab frowned. I think it might. Then write, but write in a way that remembers where they came from. Not just ingredients, stories, mistakes, doubts, they matter too. And so began a second ledger, this one written less like a pharmacist's notes and more like a traveler's journal. Alert. From the bathhouse cleaner's aunt, quince soaked overnight in salt water delays bleeding. May cause nausea, used in spring, not winter. Or, a woman named Leela swore by dried purslane steeped with vinegar. Said it gave her 2 years of rest after her 4th child. Was messy, incomplete, full of contradictions. But it was human, and perhaps that was enough. As the years passed and Yusef's beard whitened, his shelves remained full, his scales steady. He still sold remedies for headaches and heartburn, for gout and melancholy. But he knew, in the private chambers of his mind, that the quietest things he sold were often the most important. He never gave them names they didn't want. He never promised more than he could offer. Simply handed over a sachet or a vial and said, "Steep for 7 breaths. Take before the moon rises. If you bleed, rest. If not, return." And they did. Again and again, they returned. Women with hope, with fear, with gratitude, with stories. Women who remembered and passed the remembering on, because memory was a kind of midwife too. It's in the absence of safety, in the presence of silence. Sometimes memory was all they had. The village of Tali Safid was the kind of place that barely showed up on maps. Nestled between almond orchards and wind-smoothed hills, it sat on a slow bend in the road between Yazd and Isfahan, too small to draw pilgrims. Too dry for lush farming, but just sturdy enough to outlast the passing centuries. Its women, like its houses, were built for endurance. Low to the ground, often wrapped in sun-bleached cotton, with hands that smelt of flour and thyme. They did not think of themselves as wise women, nor as physicians. Most could not read Arabic, and fewer still had ever seen a city apothecary. But when a girl missed her monthly bleeding, or a mother wept over too many mouths to feed, they knew what to do. They didn't call it contraception. They simply called it Pak Shodan cleansing. Cleansing the womb, cleansing the body, cleansing the bad air, or the sorrow, or the stuck blood. The exact cause was never discussed too sharply, but the cure was always close at hand. A grandmother might say, she should chew fresh rue with salt, first thing in the morning. An aunt might suggest, let her sit over a steaming bowl of vinegar and crushed basil leaves. A neighbor might offer a packet of dried pomegranate flowers wrapped in cloth, whispering steep for 2 days. Pour it into the bath. Then, wait, there were no certificates hung on walls, no formal education. That didn't make the knowledge less real. The women of Tali Safid had developed their own calendar, their own timing, and their own wisdom. They knew the herbs that grew in the crevices behind the well. They knew which plants grew hot in the body and which cooled the blood. They knew that certain things were best done on moonless nights, and others under starlight, and still others on Fridays, never Thursdays. And above all, they knew how to whisper. No one announced their intentions aloud. A daughter didn't say, "I want to prevent pregnancy." She simply borrowed a copper pot from her cousin's house, the one with the almond-shaped notch on. The remand that was enough. Everyone understood. No one needed to ask. The remedies themselves were as humble as the women who prepared them. Crushed wild carrots soaked in rosewater, goat bile mixed with honey and rubbed into the navel. Tea made from dried mint, cinnamon bark, and a single clove steeped before sunrise and sipped with eyes closed. Each had its own recipe, its own timing, and though they were shared freely, each woman seemed to add something personal, specific prayer, a whispered phrase, a moment of silence before drinking. This was medicine woven with memory. Is not written in books, but passed through steaming cups and scalded. Fingertips and the soft rustle of skirts on packed earth floors. It was not without danger. Some herbs were too strong. Pennyroyal could stop a pregnancy, yes, but it could also stop a heart if taken in the wrong measure. Wild rue could bring on bleeding, but it could also poison the liver. Wormwood brewed too long brought nausea, hallucinations, or worse. But these dangers were known, talked about, measured and hedged with caution. That's enough to make you clean, a woman might say, but if you add more, you'll be meeting the angel of death. Laughter often followed such warnings, not out of cruelty, but out of familiarity. They had seen enough births and enough blood to know the borderlands between life and death were thin and often walked barefoot. In this way, the midwives of Tali Sefid, who were never formally called midwives, were at once scientists, spiritual guides, and counselors. They helped women manage the great cycle of hope and fear that came with the ticking of the womb. Sometimes they helped begin life, but just as often they helped delay it. There was no shame in this, at least not among women. The shame lived in the silence of men who asked too little or too late, in the sighs of fathers who didn't know how to count nappies or jars of lentils, in the calloused hands of mothers who could not imagine another winter with another mouth. The women helped each other quietly, and this was a kind of sisterhood older than books. One of the oldest among them was called Bibi Khorshid, whose fingers were so gnarled they could barely hold a thread. Yet she still walked from house to house, leaning on a stick of pomegranate wood. She smelt of turmeric and ashes. Her voice had gone thin from age, but when she spoke, the younger women listened. She was the one who knew which trees wept resin in the right season. She could tell if a mixture was too strong just by the smell of the steam. She claimed her great-grandmother had learnt from a traveling Jewess who came through the region disguised as a cloth seller. Not every woman you meet is just what she seems, Bibi Khorshid often said. Some carry the old knowledge, the true knowledge. You must watch, not just listen. And so, even as some of the younger girls dreamed of going to Yazd or Qom to learn medicine, they still came back to her when the moon ran late. Because even the city physicians could not always explain what a woman knew in her gut. Even the learnt ones didn't always understand why a certain mixture had to be stirred 13 times. Or why copper worked better than tin. Or why you never prepared anything on the third night of a marriage. Some knowledge lives in the body, not in the mind. Some medicine is made with a kind of memory that doesn't need ink. As the seasons turned in Tali Sefid, the women's work continued not only during births, but in all the months between. They cooked, they sang, and they weaved. They told stories by firelight, and in between they passed on little packets of leaves, slips of cloth stained with oil, and jars sealed with wax. Sometimes they wrote tiny symbols on the packets, just a petal or a curve to remind the next woman when and how to use them. Other times they simply looked into each other's eyes and said, "Remember," and they did. Because remembering was the one form of resistance no one could forbid. It was how they loved, how they mourned, how they survived. And so, long before the physicians of the cities wrote their treatises, long before the empires debated morality and medicine, the women of places like Toli Sifid had already built a quiet library of the body, one whisper at a time. In the shadows behind the mosque, where sunlight only touched the walls briefly each morning, women sometimes sat quietly with their backs against the warm bricks. The mosque was for prayer, for law, for public instruction. But the courtyard, well, that was another matter. That was where women waited. For their sons, for their husbands, for something to pass or to begin. And sometimes, just sometimes, for advice. It was said in Tali Sefidon, perhaps in every village like it, that the most dangerous woman was not the one who asked too many questions, but the one who remembered too many answers. These were not cities. There were no royal libraries here, no manuscript illuminators, no court-trained physicians, yet the relationship between pregnancy, religion, and knowledge remained as tangled here as it was in Isfahan or Baghdad, just quieter, hidden behind doors that opened only to women. You see, within every bowl of herbs and whispered spell, there lingered a question that no one wanted to answer aloud. Was it permissible? The older women of the village would tell you that protecting one's health was a God-given right. God, in His mercy, gave plants for healing and the moon for counting, that a woman who already had 5 children and only 2 loaves of bread could not be asked to risk another child, just to please the unspoken laws of men who would never carry it. But still, the fear hovered, especially during Friday's sermons, when younger women sat at the edges of the crowd, pretending to pray while listening carefully to what the Mueller would or would not say. If he mentioned the duty of wives, or the miracle of motherhood, or the punishment for those who disobeyed their station, a tension would pass through them like a chill breeze, not because they disagreed with faith. Feared its interpretation. Most village clerics didn't speak directly about contraception. They might mention the sin of spilling seed, or the importance of large families, or the rewards in the next world for bearing hardship in this one. But even silence was a kind of ruling, so the women made their own rulings, their own calendars. They counted the days not only from the crescent moon, but also from their own bleeding. They watched for signs, the heaviness in the legs, the soreness in the chest, the dreams that shifted from dry deserts to rivers and fish. These signs told them where they were in their own private cycle, and from that they knew when to act. They called it the counting, and it was no less sacred than any prayer. Every woman had her own method. Some used dried pomegranate seeds, moving one from one pouch to another each night. Others scratched notches into the underside of the lid of their cooking pots. Bold ones, usually the ones with literate husbands, kept secret calendars inside folded pages of Qurans or cookbooks, pretending the numbers were recipes. But the act itself was rarely discussed, especially not in front of men. Most men thought their wives knew nothing of timing. They imagined fertility as random, like rain or like a coin toss. But the truth was, their wives often knew more than the mullahs or the city doctors. They knew that certain nights were more dangerous than others. They knew that nursing a child could delay the return of fertility, but only if suckling was frequent and uninterrupted. They knew that the white of the egg was not just a food, but a sign, the body's way of whispering now. And so they built their own theology. Quiet, private, deeply rooted in the rhythm of their own lives. They believed that Allah would not burden a woman beyond what she could bear. They believed that intention mattered. That using herbs to avoid a seventh pregnancy was not the same as rejecting the will of God. It was, in its own way, honoring his gift of reason. This belief gave them strength, even when the formal authorities disagreed. There are stories of women in other villages, not Tell-i-Sifid, but not far from it, who were scolded by judges for using womb-binding charms, for burying saffron in shells at the threshold of their homes, for wearing talismans carved with forbidden prayers. But in most cases, the authorities looked away. As long as there were no loud accusations, no public scandal, and no defiance, then these quiet acts of bodily sovereignty went unpunished. Still, the women never forgot the risk. This is why most of their remedies were framed not as contraception, but as cleansing, purifying, and preparing the womb. They used the language of religion even as they skirted its laws. A tea to bring balance, steam to remove cold humors, a ritual bath for spiritual renewal. No one said, "I don't want another child." Instead, they said, "My body is weak." Or the midwife said, "I need time." Or, most often, nothing at all. And the herbs did their work in silence. Among the most respected was Harmalsarian rue. Seeds were burned to chase away evil spirits. But its leaves were soaked in vinegar and applied to the belly to reset the womb. Another was anab, the jujube fruit, ground with its seeds and drunk with goat milk during the third day of bleeding, said to restore balance and protect against overfertility. And of course, there was the mixture of care, thistle combined with dried mint and a whisper of camphor. The village women said it was good for cooling the womb. The terminology may sound vague to us now, but within those phrases were layers of meaning. Cooling the womb often meant reducing fertility. Cleansing meant bringing on a delayed period. Preparing could mean anything from abortion to mood balancing to relief from cramps. They spoke in metaphor to protect themselves. But the knowledge was real. Some of it was trial and error, handed down through centuries. Some of it was whispered from travelers, Turkic nomads, Jewish healers, and Zoroastrian grandmothers who had lived quietly after conversion. And some came from the distant echo of city medicine, softened by distance and reshaped by the needs of rural women. For example, the 10th century Persian physician, Razi, had written about azale withdrawals, a form of contraception, and acknowledged its legitimacy under certain conditions. His works were too advanced for most villagers to read, but sometimes an idea traveled faster than paper. And so, withdrawal became another unspoken strategy. A woman might advise her niece to tie her hair in a certain way to discourage conception, but the real advice, buried between the lines, was, tell him to wait, pull away before the seed is cast. There were even prayers for this. Not from the mosque, but from older text folk versions of pre-Islamic blessings repurposed in the Muslim world. Lines like, may the seed return to the soil and the body to rest. May the womb remain shut as the pomegranate before autumn. May the night pass without root or branch. These were not canonical, but they were sacred too. Those who used them. They gave voice to the tension between duty and exhaustion, between piety and survival. Because at the core of it all was this simple truth. Women wanted to live, to care for the children they already had, to feed them with more than just bread, to stay alive long enough to see them grow. And for that, they needed time, space, breath. And so they took what knowledge they could, shaped it with care, and passed it on. From mother to daughter, from cousin to neighbor, from midwife to bride. Even when the laws were uncertain, even when the preachers frowned, even when the body rebelled, they made their calendars anyway, not on paper, not on stone, but in memory, in rhythm, in the calendar of the womb. And still there lingered one question. It's often left unspoken even among sisters. There was a saying, older than anyone could name, passed from midwife to apprentice, whispered only at the edge of fields or over boiling kettles. If the plant will not prevent it, may still undo. It was a dark saying, a careful one. Yes. Because undoing was not a word spoken lightly in the world of medieval Iran. To undo a pregnancy meant interfering with fate, and fate, too many, was divine. But to a village woman with too many mouths to feed, or a body already hollowed by childbirth, or a husband lost to war, caravan, or opium, the question was not whether such action was godly. It was whether she would live. Mint and counting days no longer held, when dreams turned heavy and the belly felt like river stone. The women turned to something older than permission. They turned to one another. In Tali Safed, this was done quietly. Always quietly. No. There was no such thing as an abortion in the language of the village. There were no words for termination or induced miscarriage. What existed were euphemisms. The womb has turned cold. She is taking the bitter tea. She needs rest to bring balance. These phrases were shield slayers of silence, to keep out suspicion, to preserve honor, and to leave room for denial if questioned. Among the tools they used, none were official, but all were known. The herbal steep of last resort the most. Common was a bitter tea known only to a few older women. Its recipe was never written, but every midwife worth her salt knew its core, pennyroyal, for its pungent strength and its history as a shaker of the womb. Black cumin to stir. The blood, wild rue, not just burnt now, but boiled until the whole house stank of its smoke. Vinegar added at the end, to tighten the pulse and loosen the seed. The tea was taken 3 nights in a row, always in secret. Its effect was uncertain. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Sometimes it brought cramps and bleeding and a terrible fever. Sometimes it did nothing at all. Sometimes, more often than anyone admitted it, brought silence. A silence that began in the womb, then traveled outward. Into the house, into the woman's gate, into her future. Because if it worked, she bore the memory of what had been almost a child. And if it failed, she carried both the child and the risk. There were rules even for this. The midwives never gave the tea past the 6th week, though they never used those words. Instead, they said, if the moon has turned twice since your last bleeding, it is too late. Too late because it wouldn't work, because it might cause more damage than relief. Too late because by then the spirit was believed to have entered the womb. This belief came from a blend of folk religion, Galenic medicine, and Islamic thought. In Islamic scholarship, the ensoulment of the fetus was said to occur at 120 days, though some traditions held earlier views. But in the villages, the soul was a more fluid thing, less to days than to signs. If the woman had dreamed of rivers or pomegranates, if she had stopped vomiting and begun to glow, if her breasts had filled and her cravings had shifted from sour to sweet, then they believed the soul had already come. No midwife would intervene after that. Not because she feared the law, but because she feared God. The physical methods. Sometimes, if the tea failed and the pregnancy was still new, other methods were whispered about. Some spoke of women who jumped from low stone walls or sat on clay jugs full of hot steam. Some said squatting over heated stones helped. Others tied heavy stones to their waists and walked in circles at night. But none of these methods were reliable and all carried risk. Worse still were those who sought help from the wrong kind of healer, the charlatan, the impatient apprentice, or the one with bitter hands. There were stories, true or not, goose quills dipped in pomegranate vinegar and inserted far too deeply, of willow branches soaked in oil, of fine needles, of bruising the lower back, of prayers written backward and swallowed with sheep's blood. Most of these stories were told as warnings, not encouragement. But they served as a reminder. When all else failed, desperation could turn sacred knowledge into something more dangerous than ignorance. The price of silence there were. No midwives punished for causing a miscarriage in Tali Sifid, no trials. No public shame. That did not mean there were no consequences. If a woman bled too heavily and died, it was called a sickness of the womb. If the fetus came too early, it was said to be not meant by Allah. If a husband grew suspicious, the midwife might leave the village for a few months, returning only once the whispers died. But most of the time, it remained hidden. Midwives did not record such things. They did not confess them. Their ledger was in memory, their court, the judgment of time. And yet for all the risk, for all the silence, for all the pain most, women trusted them because they had no one else. Not the city doctors who saw them as peasants. Not the mullahs who spoke of duty but not of fatigue. Not their husbands who rarely understood the price of another pregnancy. Not even themselves. Sometimes until the midwife took their hand and said, "You are not the only one."
No.
Redemption and return if the remedy worked. The woman rested. She returned to her garden. She returned to her loom. She sang again, too. Her children, but always she carried it. A quiet grief. A quiet relief. A scar no one could see. And if it failed, well, then the midwife helped in other ways. With birth, with bleeding, with naming the child, even if the mother could not. Because that was the unspoken contract. If I cannot prevent it, then I will help you survive. Midwives never judged. They didn't have time. They had seen too much. They had seen young wives marry old men and bear babies that were never wanted. They had seen girls no older than 12 give birth to stillborn twins. They had seen women raped during caravan raids, or by their masters, or by cousins who were never punished. They had seen hunger hollow the belly faster than any child could fill it. And so they offered what they could. Not freedom, but a sliver of control. A spoonful of rue. A moment of mercy. A final whisper, there's a grave just outside Tali Sefid, half swallowed by the hillside. No name marks it. Only a crooked stone and a circle of time that grows taller than the rest. They say it belongs to the midwife who died without children of her own. They say she knew every plant and every moon. They say her touch was enough to calm a breech birth or stop a pregnancy before it ever took hold. And they say that on spring nights, if you sit quietly and press your ear to the soil, you can still hear her whispering the old calendar. 1 seed for the month. 1 seed for the moon. 1 seed for the silence. 1 seed for the bloom. You are in Nishaper. The year is 1125. The city lies quiet in the early morning light. The tiled domes glint faintly with the sun's first warmth, and the sound of broom sweeps. Brushing dust from courtyards hums like a lullaby for the day to come. Somewhere in the south of the city, under a heavy beam of carved cedar and a ceiling painted in blue and ochre, a young woman named Fatima sits still, while a man with ink-stained fingers unrolls a sheet of parchment. Her mother, older and quieter than she once was, rests her hand on Fatima's knee. The man is a KTB, a professional contract writer. This is his fourth marriage contract of the week. But this one is different. Tucked in the list of standard phrases terms for the bride wealth, conditions of inheritance, length of cohabitation, there is a small and subtle clause. The husband shall not compel his wife to bear children, nor object to her use of preventative remedies, for a period not less than 5 full years from the date of consummation. He does not question it. The clause has become more common in households like these: wealthy, urban, educated, and cautious. The father is not present. He passed away last spring, but the mother has done her homework. Then bridegroom is a scholar's son, with soft hands and watery eyes. He's nervous, but agreeable. There is no public scandal. No one outside the family will hear the phrase spoken aloud. What is written, witnessed, and sealed. You might ask yourself, why? Why would a woman in 12th century knee shaper want to delay childbirth? The answer lies in the quiet accumulation of reasons: fear of early death during childbirth, fear of losing social standing due to illness or infertility, the desire to delay household obligations, or even though it is rarely of affection for the husband. Some women were more honest with themselves than they were with others. In medieval Iran, under the framework of Islamic law, the marriage contract nikah was not merely a religious ceremony. It was a legal instrument. It was flexible, negotiable, and held the weight of courts and social expectation alike. Though the Quran emphasized marriage and procreation as moral goods, it left considerable room for interpretation. Women of certain classes, particularly in the urban centers, knew how to exploit those margins. In Fatima's case, her mother remembered what had happened to her own cousin, married at 15, pregnant by 16, widowed by 18, with a sickly child and no dowry money left. That cousin never recovered her social standing. She had no clauses in her contract, no terms, only expectation. So this time, things would be different. Fatima had been given a small chest of her own to keep beneath her bedding. It held more than the usual trousseau of embroidered linens and jewelry. Inside were 5 sealed parchment slips, each written by an herbalist near the bazaar. Small notes about pessaries made of gum acacia, wool soaked in pomegranate rind, and a black paste made from crushed myrtle leaves. None of these were guaranteed, but they had been passed down from woman to woman in bathhouses and kitchens, in moments when men were out of earshot. They were modest preventatives, not permanent, not foolproof, but sanctioned by silence and tradition. Some claimed to have come from the Greek physicians. Others whispered that they were written in Old Aramaic before being translated into Persian and Arabic. But whatever their origin, these preventatives only worked if they were not forbidden. And that was the power of the clause. You might be wondering, was this sort of thing common? The truth is, it was never common in the way that bread or soap was common. But it was known. Among those who could afford education, especially the merchant and scholarly classes, women were not ignorant of their options. Like Anishaper Isfahan, Ray and Shiraz, legal scholars often debated the boundaries of women's consent and marital obedience. Some sided with the more rigid Hanbali interpretations. Others favored the comparatively lenient Hanafi or Shafi perspectives, which allowed a great deal of room for stipulations. The clause Fatima and her mother wrote was not revolutionary, but it was a thread in a quiet fabric being woven by women who understood law not as restriction, but as possibility. Later that evening, after the ink had dried and the contract was tucked into a lacquered tube, Fatima sat alone for the last time in her mother's house. The house had changed little. Since her birth, the same mulberry tree drooped over the wall. The same iron kettle whistled with steam. But Fatima knew this might be the last quiet evening she would have for a long while. She removed one of the slips from the chest and held. It too, the light. It read, "Take the husk of a walnut, dry it, and burn it into ash. Mix with rose water and smear lightly on wool. Insert before the act and remove before sleep." It smelt faintly of charcoal and something bitter. It was neither romantic nor poetic. But it was hers. Throughout medieval Iran, women like Fatima were never supposed to be the protagonists of history. Most records were written by men judges, scholars, and scribes. But the contracts they left behind, sometimes dusty and forgotten in mosque libraries or private collections, tell us what they dared not say aloud. They tell us that some women did not want 10 children. Some women did not want a child at all. Some simply wanted time. Time to get to know their husband. Time to observe the household politics. Time to wait for inheritance disputes to settle. Time to strengthen their body. It's time to hope that maybe, just maybe, they could love someone else. None of this was recorded in chronicles, but it was embedded in clauses. What was the husband's perspective? It was harder to know. In some cases, men objected later, especially if the woman used her contract to delay pregnancy well beyond the stated term. In rare cases, men brought disputes to court arguing that the clause was against divine purpose. Some qadis ruled in favor of the man. Others, especially in urban centers like Baghdad or Nishapur, upheld the contract. But often, men did not object. The language was there. The witnesses had signed. The ink was dry. It is easy in the modern world to imagine medieval law as crude, monolithic, or oppressively one-sided. But medieval Islamic jurisprudence was intricate, sometimes surprisingly accommodating, and often deeply situational. Scholars spent years memorizing not just scripture, but precedent and local practice. If a woman had her clause written correctly, and if her family had the social leverage to protect her, she could carve a space for herself that the Quran itself had left open. Of course, this space was not available to everyone. Rural women, poor women, slaves, and young girls with no family protection rarely had the opportunity to insert clauses like Fatima's. Their contracts were often oral or quickly drafted. Their needs went unspoken or were considered irrelevant. Even in cities, women with no male guardian or legal knowledge were vulnerable. But the story of Fatima reminds us that even in a world of limitations, there were ways to draw a boundary. With ink, that evening, as the city quieted into the heavy darkness of sleep, Fatima placed the parchment slip back into her chest and lay down on her bedding.
Ow.
Her wedding would take place the next day. Her husband would arrive with musicians and trays of rice, lamb, and sweetened pistachios. But her clause would remain in place. 5 years. 5 years of space, of choice, of breath. And whether she would use the wool and walnut husk, or whether she would find a gentler way to avoid what she was not yet ready for, that decision, too, would be hers. And so we are left to wonder how many women across the centuries had written similar clauses, quiet, private, almost invisible, and used the law to protect something that the world so often took for granted. The air in the bazaar of Nishapur is full of smells that are difficult to name. Ground coriander dust, the slightly deep, sour tank of vinegar-soaked herbs, and the unmistakable sharpness of something recently boiled down into a dark glass bottle. It is early morning again, but not the same morning. Weeks have passed. Fatima has settled into her new husband's home, a modest 2-story dwelling. With latticework screens and a painted prayer niche, her days are quiet but not idle. She manages the kitchen. She inspects the linens for moth holes. She avoids the questions about children with a patient smile and the slow grace that her mother taught her. Today, she walks through the winding aisles of the women's market, past stalls that shimmer with embroidered veils and heaped almonds. Her destination is not food or fabric, but a narrow shop front between a cobbler and a perfumer.
Ow.
No sign hangs above the lintel, but inside, the shelves are packed with parchment rolls, ceramic jars, cloth satchels, and bundles of dried leaves. This is the shop of Tonk de Zara, though no one calls her that aloud. She is not anyone's aunt, nor is her name Zara, but among the women of Nishapur, She is known as such because everyone pretends she is a harmless old relative. Zara does not sell magic. She is careful never to use charms or verses that would bring the suspicion of the mutasib, the market inspector. Instead, she offers remedies to regulate the womb, tonics for excessive bile, and treatments for women's irritability. All of these, of course, are code. Fatima sits across from her and places a folded square of silk on the table. Inside is a list of recipe copied in her own handwriting. It is not the first time Zara has seen it. Crucius seed, soaked in vinegar, then boiled until half reduced. Add pomegranate peel, powdered aloes, and 1 peppercorn. Apply with soft wool, not more than an hour before intercourse. The ingredients are not expensive, but the proportions matter. And Zara, who has spent a lifetime testing variations on recipes passed down from her grandmother's grandmother, knows exactly how to modify them. She flips open a leather-bound notebook. Its pages are lined with tidy notations, not names. Never names but small details. Client. W, age 18, newlywed. Wants a 1-year delay. Sensitive to vinegar, prefers an oil base. Client, age 34, for births already. Wants a gap between 4th and 5th. Husband unaware. Recommends a stronger formula. Client, F. Possibly this one. First time use? Moderate strength. No allergens noted. It's likely upper-class carried saffron pouch. The ledger is a life's work of quiet service. Zara is not a doctor. She has no formal schooling, but she has spent 3 decades listening to what women do. Not say aloud. Fatima nods toward the jars on the shelf. Zara selects one filled with crushed rue, then another with powdered aloe. She works quickly but not carelessly, stirring the mixture in a small clay bowl. The paste is dark and aromatic, sharp with vinegar and something else, something ancient. You will need to reheat it slightly before use, Zara says, not looking up. A spoon's worth. Wool, not cotton. Cotton breathes too much. Fatima listens intently, committing each detail to memory. She is not sure she will use the remedy soon, but she wants it in her possession. She wants the option. That, in itself, is a kind of safety. Zara pauses before handing her the small jar. Has he asked? Fatima hesitates. It's not yet. He assumes we will wait a while. He is gentle. I think he prefers books to babies. Zara chuckles softly. Then perhaps you will never need this. But better to keep it in your sleeve. There are no written prescriptions, no official stamps. Zara's work lives in shadows and suggestion, protected by ambiguity and by the unspoken trust of hundreds of women. She is not the only herbalist. Who does this? But she is one of the few who keeps careful track of what works and what doesn't. She never repeats failed recipes. She adjusts. She remembers. Outside the shop, the bazaar grows louder. A fruit vendor shouts over the crowd. A boy chases a goat into a pottery stall. The noise is cheerful and chaotic. But inside, there is calm. Zara wipes her hands and returns. To the ledger, Fatima tucks the jar into a lined compartment in her satchel and offers a short bow of thanks. No money changes hands now. It will come later, indirectly through the household servant. As she walks back through the city, past tiled domes and dusty courtyards, Fatima reflects on what her mother told her the night before the wedding. If you ever feel small, remember, men build houses, but women decide what grows inside them. The jar weighs very little, but in her hands, it feels like armor. It would be tempting to romanticize Zara as a kind of rebel healer, defying the patriarchy with pomegranate paste and pepper seeds. But the truth is more ordinary and more interesting. Zara is not radical. She is practical. She is working within a long, slow, flexible tradition that dates back to Galen, to Dioscorus, and to the midwives of Alexandria and Gonda. The medical texts of the Islamic world were full of references to mafatithed openers and mumsiaket, closers. These were terms used to describe substances that could either stimulate or block conception. Learned physicians like Avicenna ibn Sina wrote about them with a physician's detachment. But in the hands of women, these theories became lived tools. There is even a passage in Avicenna's Canon of Medicine where he lists several contraceptive agents: wool soaked in oil of bitter almond, pomegranate blossoms with vinegar, and alum with rose oil, ... These may reduce the likelihood of conception when properly applied. He adds a cautious note, but efficacy may vary with the woman's temperament. This was not secret knowledge. It was simply ignored by most men, and quietly practiced by women who had everything to lose from too many pregnancies too close together. In Fatima's case, her husband remained respectful, perhaps even indifferent. He spent much of his time in the theological library, debating minor points of Quranic grammar. He spoke little at home, did not ask for children, nor did he question her practices. Whether this was kindness or distance, Fatima could not say, but it gave her space in which her body belonged to herself. Months passed. The seasons turned. In spring, she planted lavender near the cistern. In summer, she stayed inside, reading her late father's books on mathematics. In autumn, she saw Zara again, not for more contraceptives, but for a friend who had married too young. At no point did she use the jar of paste, but it remained in her chest, cool and dark, a reminder that her future was not entirely out of her hands. And perhaps that is the real heart of the story. Not that every woman in medieval Iran avoided pregnancy or even wanted to, but some did. Some prepared for the chance to choose. Whether through legal clauses, wool-soaked herbs, the wisdom of women like Zara, they found small ways to delay what the world considered inevitable. They bought time, and in doing so they made space for themselves in history, if only in the margins. There are many ways a person can be forgotten. A name lost. A house was sold. A grave weathered to blank stone. But in some cases, it is fire that does the forgetting hot, sudden, and indiscriminate. One such fire consumed part of the old Qadi court in Qazvin sometime in the mid-13th century. No one recorded the exact date. It was likely a minor blazer. Sparked by an overturned lamp or an ill-tended brazier, the fire was quickly put out, the damage assessed, and the walls rebuilt.
Ash.
But among the ash and scorched beams, a clerk named Ibrahim recovered a bundle of partially burnt papers. Most were contracts, sales of sheep, agreements over land inheritance, notes about dowries and debts. Ibrahim, a tidy and curious man, attempted to salvage what he could. He unwrapped the documents one by one, brushing soot from their corners. Transcribing what survived, one of them stood out. It had been neatly penned in the hand of a court scribe, ink, still faintly legible in places. The outer layer had burnt away, but the center survived, preserving the marriage contract of a woman named Zainab bint Musa and a man called Yahya ibn Khalid. Zainab's name appears clearly at the top. It's followed by her lineage and her stated bride price: 20 dinars of gold, a silver belt, and 3 measures of saffron. But it is a clause further down, now only partially intact, that caught Ibrahim's attention. It reads, "And she shall not be compelled to bear more than 2 children. And if she shall fall pregnant again against her will, she may seek remedy by advice of..." The rest of the sentence is lost in fire-blackened paper. But even that fragment is remarkable. No formal Islamic law required or permitted a wife to limit the number of children she would bear. And yet, nothing forbade such a clause either provided. It was agreed upon, witnessed, and recorded. In many Islamic jurisdictions, the marriage contract was a flexible legal tool. The default terms were standard, but additions could be appended. Clauses allowing the wife to live separately, to retain property, and to initiate divorce under certain conditions. Zainab's contract seems to have included one such addition. A gentle line in careful script, negotiated before witnesses. Written with ink and deliberation, stating that she would not be expected to have more than 2 children. Ibrahim made a note of the document in the margin of his salvage ledger. Strange clause. Childbirth limit. Consult Sheikh Harun on precedent. That consultation never happened. The court archives, already incomplete, were eventually disbanded. When Mongol forces entered the region, the documents that remained were scattered, lost, or repurposed. Some were sold as scrap for bookbinding. Others were burnt for warmth in winter. The copy of Zainab's contract survived only as a partial transcription in Ibrahim's ledger. which itself remained buried in a library storeroom until it resurfaced centuries later during a cataloging project in Tehran. So who was Zainab bint Musa? The answer, like much of history's quieter truths, is a matter of inference, not proof. Her name suggests she came from a well-known merchant family. Bint Musa implies lineage, likely the daughter of a textile trader or a landholder. The mention of saffron as part of her bride price confirms that she came from wealth. Saffron was expensive and often reserved for the upper classes, used in perfumes, dyes, and medicinal infusions. We can guess that she was educated, or at least surrounded by people who were. The presence of a contractual clause so specific, so deliberate, indicates either her own legal literacy or that of someone in her family. Perhaps a mother, perhaps a sister who had died in childbirth, perhaps a cousin who whispered things. During wedding preparations, things no men were meant to overhear. Let us imagine her quietly, respectfully, and without certainty.
8.
She lives in a tall house with a courtyard where oranges grow. She has one child, a boy named Musa after her father. Her second pregnancy is difficult. Fever, a hemorrhage, a month of recovery during which she hears her own name recited in the prayers for the ill. She survives, and after that she chooses not to risk it again. Her husband Yoya perhaps agrees, or perhaps he objects, and she gently reminds him of the clause. Maybe he forgets, and she shows him the copy sealed in the family chest, still tied with red cord. Or maybe, just maybe, he understands without protest because he is known. Too many women who did not survive the third birth. There are no loud confrontations, no court battles, it's only silence and respect, and a life that continues with 2 children and no more. Years pass, the contract ages, the ink fades. One day, Zainab dies, not in childbirth, but in her sleep, at a time of her choosing, in a body that remained her own. This story is imagined, but the clause is real. It was written, it was witnessed, was copied, burnt, and copied again. In a world where women's choices are often recorded only when they break the rules, this one, line buried in legal formality, tells us something profound. That Zainab, and women like her, found ways to say no without shouting. Their resistance was not rebellion, it was an agreement. Negotiation, ink, not fire, and though the fire took the contract, it could not take the fact that she wrote it. Zainab is not alone in history. Across medieval Iran, similar stories played. Out in kitchens, in herbalist shops, and in quiet conversations between sisters. Sometimes the efforts were physical herbs, and timing and careful calculations. Sometimes they were legal, sometimes they were just deeply personal acts of silence. But all were ways of managing the immense, invisible labor of fertility. Today, historians find traces of these women in scattered court records, in medical treatises, and in poetry that describes the bitter almond oil used by a lover who would not mother. They appear in footnotes, in burnt margins, in second-hand references, and hushed traditions passed down in domestic spaces. They appear most of all in contracts, folded pieces of parchment that once fit into the sleeves of bridal robes. The world expected them to bear. Many did. But some, like Zainab, chose limits, and those choices, however faint, still echo. You are standing at the threshold of a small clay-walled kitchen in the back of a modest courtyard home in 11th century. Ray. The smell of crushed roux rises faintly from the wooden mortar on the shelf. It's still warm from the afternoon sun, and inside, a middle-aged woman in a pale indigo, chatter faded from repeated hand-washings in the communal canal, lifts a thin copper spoon to her lips. She tastes the dark, bitter decoction and grimaces. What she has just swallowed is not for illness, nor for strength. It's for something less visible, something she cannot speak of aloud when the neighbor's boys are within earshot, certainly not when her husband is reading in the courtyard. She has taken it to delay life, not end it, just hold it off. A pause, a deferral, a quiet spoonful of space between this day and the possibility of another child. This is not a rare moment, nor is it dramatic. It is simply part of what many women did routinely, modestly, and without any grand language when they needed to pace the shape of their lives in a time when formal control over fertility was almost entirely absent from male conversation and public documentation. The use of domestic herbs and kitchen ingredients to avoid pregnancy was neither officially sanctioned nor officially condemned. It existed in the gray areas between medicine, folk knowledge, and superstition. And like much of women's wisdom, in the medieval Islamic world, it was shared in small, cautious doses in the bathhouse, the kitchen, or the back corner of a garden, usually passed between women with no witnesses and no records. But if you look closely at surviving medical texts, at bathhouse recipes, at poetry, at fragments of letters and pharmacological scrolls, you begin to see its outline. You see a system that revolved around the quiet agents of birth spacing, the herbs, oils, powders, and practices designed not to terminate pregnancy but to prevent or delay it. Let us linger for a while in those kitchens. A kitchen is not just for bread in cities like Ray, Shiraz, and Isfahan. Urban homes often included a small kitchen garden, usually tended by the women of the household. These gardens grew more than food. They grew memory. They grew a legacy. Rue de Graviolans rue was one of the most prized plants for women's health. Its sharp medicinal scent was said to drive away evil spirits and unwanted guests, which may have been a polite euphemism for other kinds of banishment. Infused in oil or steeped into a tea, it was thought to regulate the menstrual cycle. It was also used post-intercourse in diluted form as a pessary or oral remedy to cool the womb. Other commonly used plants included pennyroyal, an import from Byzantium and later adopted in the Safavid period, pomegranate peel, especially dried and powdered with vinegar or salt black seed nigella sativa, often taken with honey myrrh, ground and mixed with ghee licorice root, sometimes. Used to soften stronger preparations, these ingredients were never recorded in religious texts indeed. Clerics rarely commented on contraception beyond abstract discussions, but they did appear in the margins of medical treatises, especially those compiled by male physicians with an interest in women's disorders. For example, the 10th century polymath Ali ibn Abus al-Majusi, in his Kukmil al-Inaukubiya, the complete book of the medical art, mentioned substances that could weaken conception, though he couched them in terms of treating excessive fertility. Similarly, Avicenna ibn Sina hinted at pessaries made of bitter herbs, though always as a way to cool the body after intercourse, not explicitly to prevent pregnancy, but perhaps with that effect, but in the kitchens. The language was clearer. These seeds will hold off the red moon, an elderly aunt might say, or drink this and he will not plant anything. It was everyday poetry for something as old as choice. Bathhouse exchanges and coded recipes, most women didn't write these recipes down. They performed them. Recipes were rituals, wrapped in habit. But in the public hammams, where women bathed and socialized together, there was room for exchange, not just of water and soap, but of knowledge. While men's hammams were often austere places of business and grooming, women's bathhouses had a different rhythm. They were sites of storytelling, gossip, and health maintenance. Older women, the equivalents of midwives or herbalists, were often invited in to help prepare younger brides for marriage. These women, known in Persian as kronazan, literally women's workers, dispense mixtures for beauty, fertility, and prevention. There are 13th and 14th century Persian bathhouse manuals, translated much later by Ottoman scribes, that describe cooling salves made of crushed rose, beeswax, and pomegranate bark, inserted gently with wool.
Oh.
Some texts claim they protected the inner channel from inflammation after intercourse, but footnotes suggest some were also used to block the seed. Sometimes ingredients were listed plainly: rue, vinegar, olive oil, and aloe. Other times they were veiled in metaphor. One bathhouse guide described a contraceptive as the clasping of silver leaves on a closed pomegranate. Scholars have interpreted this as either a symbolic diagram or a poetic memory device, a way to remember the mixture without writing it outright. The hammam was not just for cleanliness, it was a laboratory of survival. The male silence on contraception. It is important to note how deeply gendered the silence around pregnancy prevention was. Male authors of religious texts like Al-Ghazali who discuss coitus interruptus azil in theological terms, tended to focus on male-controlled methods. Withdrawal was debated in terms of legality and consent, but female-controlled methods, especially herbal preparations, were treated as either fringe or superstition. This created a double-layered culture: official silence and unofficial fluency. In the official world, a man might read that it was permissible to withdraw with his wife's consent, but that any device or drink that blocked pregnancy was unnatural or dubious. In the unofficial world, his wife might already be boiling rue and grinding nutmeg with dried orange peel after he went to sleep. The household became a site of parallel knowledge, systems one male and textual, the other female and oral. It is hard to say how effective these herbal methods were. Some, like pennyroyal and rue, do contain known uterine stimulants. Others may have had placebo effects. Still others were likely protective in other ways, serving as infection barriers, or simply delaying the timing of intercourse through ritual. But effectiveness was not the only metric. What mattered was control, or at least the illusion of control of power women could feel in their hands, their spoons, their baths. A legacy without names. If you try to find the names of women who used these methods, you'll fail. There are no diaries, no preserved recipe books written in their own hand. But their knowledge survived in fragments: a recipe tucked into the corner of a medical scroll, a prayer amulet wrapped in cotton inside a ceramic jar, a Sufi poem mentioning the bitter cup that turns the womb away, a ruined hammam wall in Yazd, its clay jars still blackened from years of herbal brews. These women left no monuments, but they left recipes, and through them they shaped not just families, but entire generations. Unresolved thought. If these quiet kitchen rituals were so common, so ordinary, and so widespread, why did they leave behind so little in the official history? Was it because women chose to hide them, more because men chose to forget? There was no calendar on the kitchen wall, no chart with ovulation cycles, no clinic to phone, but there was the moon. For many women in medieval Iran, especially in urban households that had limited access to medical advice or religious text, time itself became a form of contraception. Time, memory, the body's own rhythms. Long before modern fertility awareness methods were formally outlined, women relied on intuitive forms of menstrual tracking, deeply rooted in observation, oral knowledge, and often tied to the lunar calendar. This section explores how medieval Iranian women marked and manipulated time, both biologically and cosmically, to delay or avoid pregnancy. It wasn't exact, and it wasn't easy, but it was real. It was theirs. Menstrual calendars without paper, a woman might track her cycles by the phases of the moon. Not because the moon caused fertility, though some believed it did, but because it was the most reliable, visible marker of passing time. She bled on the second moon, a grandmother might say, and again on the third. While helping her daughter-in-law mark charcoal dots on the wall behind a jug, it wasn't a calendar in the modern sense, but it was a calendar nonetheless. They might count 7 days forward, then 10 days safe. Then 7 uncertain, a pattern that appeared in some midwifery scrolls later found in Shiraz. While imprecise, these divisions often mimicked what we now recognize as the follicular and luteal phases of a cycle. Women also paid attention to their body's messages: warmth, dryness, slipperiness, and discomfort. There is indirect evidence from medical texts that women notice the days when water is clear versus when it is thick, a rudimentary but accurate description of changes in cervical fluid. None of this was written down formally, but it was passed down, quietly, confidently. The role of the bath, a reset point, the public hammam, visited regularly by urban women, often weekly or after menstruation, became a kind of checkpoint in the bodily calendar. Many women used the bath as a reset, a place to start the count again. When she entered the hammam, a woman might say to the dalaka, a female attendant, "Today I begin," meaning she had finished bleeding and was restarting her fertile window. Some hammam records, preserved in WAQF endowment documents, mention that certain herbs were only offered on cleansing days, a euphemism that likely referred to post-menstrual visits. There's also strong oral evidence, especially from regions like Kerman and Yazd, That women used specific salves or herbal rinses on the second or third day after their bath, timed with the presumed onset of ovulation. This wasn't accidental. It was a folk fertility clock, with the bath at its center. Pulling away, coitus interruptus in conversation, while herbal and timing methods were largely female-led. Coitus interruptus, known in Arabic and Persian as izal, required male participation. And yet women still managed it. Medieval Islamic jurists, especially during the Abbasid period, debated the legality of izal, with varying conclusions. Al-Ghazali allowed it if the wife consented. Ibn Qudama discouraged it but did not forbid it, but in the home, far from juristic libraries, it was often a practical negotiation. Some wives persuaded their husbands with words. Others may have used herbs that decrease libido. Still others simply made the act of intimacy conditional. If you do not withdraw, I will take nothing more from you. Well, it wasn't love poetry, but it worked. In many households, azal became a mutual strategy, even without a formal agreement. A man might fear having too many children, especially during famine years, and a woman might dread the dangers of another pregnancy. Together, they chose absence. But historians believe that many women combined azal with other methods, such as avoiding intimacy on dangerous days, using herbal rinses, or inserting pessaries. It was not a single method, it was a layered system, designed to give them the best odds possible in an uncertain world. When abstinence was strategically practiced, complete abstinence was not a common or expected solution in most marriages, but periodic abstinence, disguised as ritual or routine, certainly was. Women had access to religiously sanctioned reasons not to engage in intercourse. During menstruation, a time of ritual impurity, during fasting periods, especially Ramadan, during postnatal bleeding, which could last 40 days during religious retreats, or mourning during pilgrimage preparations, but beyond these, some women invented extra reasons. I have a fever. The moon is black tonight. The bread has not risen. It is an unlucky day. These reasons were not always believed, but they were respected, especially in households where wives carried the burden of domestic work, childering, and sometimes even economic survival. One record from a midwife and knee shaper recounts a woman who told her husband she was still unclean a full week after her period had ended. The midwife helped her extend the story with the aid of powdered turmeric and a blood-tinged cloth. Whether this was deception or protection depends on your perspective, but either way, it worked. This strategy hiding fertility behind purity allowed women to exert subtle control over their bodies without triggering conflict. Knowledge wrapped in shame, the methods women used to track time and shape pregnancy weren't shameful in themselves, but they often had to be hidden because open discussion of fertility implied either rebellion, dissatisfaction, or too much curiosity. One 12th century moral treatise warned that a woman who knows too much of her womb becomes arrogant. Another claimed that wives who count the moon are wives who forget their obedience. But in truth, women weren't being arrogant. They were being careful. Careful not to die in childbirth. Careful not to have more mouths than bread. Not to wear themselves to the bone by They were doing math with their bodies, even when no one gave them numbers. The limits of timing and the persistence of hope, of course. None of these methods, neither the lunar tracking, nor the herbal rinses, nor withdrawal, were foolproof. There were surprises. There were failures. Some women who had faithfully marked their moon days still conceived. Some who had used rue religiously still saw their bellies swell. And many, despite all caution, endured multiple pregnancies, some welcome, some wearying. But even in the face of uncertainty, these practices gave women a measure of predictability. It gave them language to discuss fertility without naming it, gave them rituals to delay motherhood, even if only by a year or two. And it gave them, above all, a sense of rhythm, of knowing where they stood in time and where they might go next. The moon rose, the bath was taken, the herbs were brewed, for another cycle, she hoped. By the time a daughter grew old enough to understand what her mother whispered over the fennel seeds, much of the knowledge had already shifted. Not longer medical, not quite magical, but something else entirely. Story. Folk wisdom in medieval Iran, especially that passed from woman to woman, did not live in official books or palace scrolls. It survived instead in a different form: riddles, lullabies, herbal proverbs, and the soft verses recited during tea preparation or just before a bath. In this final section, we look at how the quiet art of preventing pregnancies through timing, food, and ritual entered the cultural bloodstream of Iranian women as hidden poetry, coded advice, and even resistance, disguised as custom, because when control over the body was not granted, it was grown in secret. Proverbs for the belly and the bed in Old Persian. One might hear a saying, "Eat the seed of patience, and you will not reap a cradle." This was not advice about temperament. It was often code for drinking an infusion made with wild rue known as esfand, a plant women believed slowed the belly. Another saying, whispered behind closed doors in Khorasan, "He who plants on a full moon harvests twins," meant not for the farmer, but for the young wife. It was a coded warning to avoid intimacy during certain lunar days when fertility was believed to be strongest. Proverbs like these protected knowledge in plain sight. They allowed grandmothers and neighbors to pass on strategies without appearing immodest or disobedient. In a world where discussing reproduction was tabooing less, one was a scholar or physician, poetic ambiguity became safety. Even food carried coded meanings. Don't eat honey when your mouth is already sweet, a way to tell newlyweds to space their children. Warm herbs in winter, cold herbs in spring, a reference to balancing bodily humors, but often also to contraceptive timing. These weren't just quaint turns of phrase. They were portable libraries, encoded in rhyme and rhythm so they could survive without paper. Women's lullabies with double meaning, Iranian lullabies, were more than soothing songs. They were veiled expressions of longing, regret, or warning. A common verse from the Central Plateau: "Sleep, child, sleep, for your sister did not come. I drank the mint and rue, so only you fill my arms." Here the mother sings to her baby, revealing that she has prevented a second child from arriving. It is a tender confession, tucked inside a melody. No men need to know its meaning, but any nearby woman would understand. In some lullabies collected in the 19th century, but traced back through oral histories, women sang of the bathhouse angelus spirit they invoked to bless or block the womb. The angel would close the garden gate if asked sweetly enough, or let the bees in if ignored. This metaphor, like many, gently masked the mechanics of conception, allowing women to express agency through myth. Even when science was out of reach, poetry stepped in. Midwives and the art of misdirection. Midwives held unique social positions in medieval Iran. They were both respected and feared. They entered the home, touched the most private parts of life, and left behind remedies, but also sometimes secrets. Some midwives were literate, many were not. But all were storytellers, using coded language not just for protection, but also as a professional strategy. For example, a midwife might say, "The rose should not be watered until the third crow of the rooster," gives meaning. Avoid intercourse for 3 days after menstruation. Let the bread rise twice, then test the oven, gives meaning. Wait for clear signs of fertility before intimacy. Clients did not always need or want exact instructions. What they wanted was plausible deniability. If a husband overheard, the midwife's advice could sound harmless. If an elder questioned it, the phrases could be dismissed as superstition. But to the woman receiving care, they were as precise as a prescription. Some midwives even sang their instructions as they prepared herbs: rue and vinegar, mother's veil, keep the seed from setting sail. This rhyme referred to a post-intercourse rinse believed to reduce conception. Over generations, even when medical authorities shifted, when Greek, Persian, Arabic, and Islamic traditions blended and clashed, midwives carried on the same layered instructions, tucked inside increasingly poetic shells. The afterlife in folklore and modern echoes centuries past. Cities changed, empires rose and fell, but the kitchen knowledge of pregnancy prevention did not disappear, it simply migrated. In rural parts of Iran today, some of the same phrases and proverbs still exist. Women in Yaz still brew wormwood tea after intimacy. Elder women in Fars may still speak of the moon's danger days, especially when advising young brides. Even modern urban women discussing family planning over messaging apps. Sometimes refer to their bodies as gardens or their cycles as weather, echoing metaphors hundreds of years old. One might say, "I've closed the shutters," meaning she's avoiding pregnancy that month. The imagery remains consistent. There are also remnants in Iranian women's literature, especially in poetry by lesser-known female authors who wrote under pseudonyms. Some poems describe folded spoons and veiled roots interpreted by modern scholars as allusions to hidden contraceptive knowledge. Even lullabies recorded by anthropologists in the 20th century still carry echoes of the same old wisdom. Sleep, moon daughter, sleep, no brother in spring, no sister in fall, / your mother sang to the bath smoke. And the bath knew what to do. The bath knew what to do, even when no one else did. The weight of remembering the right to forget, there's a strange tension in this legacy. On one hand, it's a triumphant network of knowledge, built without paper, that allowed generations of women to exert some control over their reproductive lives. On the other hand, it's a burden, a reminder that this knowledge had to be hidden, sung or disguised because it was not permitted to be spoken openly. Today, historians and ethnographies reconstruct these methods slowly, cautiously, through scraps of medical treatises, household letters, and oral testimony. But much has been lost because it was never meant to be preserved. It was meant to be used like a warm cloth or a bitter tea. And perhaps that is its beauty. The knowledge lived in the kitchen, in the bath, in the rhythm of a woman's footsteps. On a tiled floor, it lived in her breath, in the way she held the spoon over the pot, in the words she chose when her daughter asked, "When will my baby brother come?" She might answer, "Not yet, child. The garden still sleeps. You are in a tiled bathhouse. The air is damp with rosemary steam. Women are gathered in quiet corners, not gossiping but murmuring, sharing handfuls of leaves and bits of dried bark, a pinch of crushed cinnamon, a spoon of vinegar, a ball of something wrapped in linen and dipped in oil. It's not for seasoning soup. It's not for perfume. It's for protection of the sort not discussed in front of men." In medieval Iran, especially between the 10th and 14th centuries, the hammam, the bathhouse, was more than a place of cleansing. For women, it was an information hub. Complaints, remedies, and secrets passed hand to hand along with combs and sponges. And among the most closely guarded knowledge was how to avoid pregnancy. This wasn't always a matter of personal choice. Sometimes it was. But more often, it was necessity cloaked in discretion. Too many mouths to feed, a husband gone to war, a body to warn from the last birth. Pregnancy, after all, was not just a private matter. It could be life-threatening. And so in the kitchens, attached to bathhouses and behind the curtains of women's quarters, an unofficial pharmacopoeia was shared. A cinnamon barrier here, a saffron bomb there. The texts and the silences, Islamic medical texts of the era, do mention birth control, but often only briefly. Avicenna ibn Sina, in his Canon of Medicine, lists a few herbs that cause the womb to reject the seed. These include myrrh, rue, wormwood, and certain vinegars. But his writings and those of other physicians like Al-Razi and Al-Tami treat the topic cautiously. Many details were passed orally, not written. Women's recipes did not often make it into male-authored texts. What we know comes from fragments, trade records of imported resins, bathhouse inventories, traveler's notes, and a few brave scribes who copied women's prescriptions in the margins. Cinnamon was among the most prized, not the coarse cassia bark that passed for cinnamon in many places, but the softer, thinner bark imported from Ceylon. It arrived in dried curls, almost sweet-smelling, with a warmth that spread through the body. In baths and homes, it was crushed, mixed with oil, often olive, or sesamein, used as a base for hab, or pessaries, herbal balls inserted vaginally, to warm the womb and dry the surplus moisture, as some texts phrased it. But what that meant, in less coded terms, was to make the environment unfriendly to conception. The theory behind the practice, according to humoral theory, the dominant medical system of the time, conception required a delicate balance of heat, moisture, and temperament. The womb had to be warm but not overheated, moist but not flooded, receptive but not inflamed. If a woman was considered to have an overly wet or cold womb, she might struggle to conceive. But if the goal was to avoid pregnancy, those very imbalances could be induced deliberately. Cinnamon, along with other warming agents like clove, ginger, and mustard seed, was believed to dry out the womb or tighten it. Used after intercourse, it was thought to either kill the male seed or prevent it from settling. A woman might apply a cinnamon paste wrapped in cloth, leave it for several hours, and then rinse with a vinegar infusion. Some remedies were even more elaborate. A 13th century herbal from Khorazm describes a 3-day preparation of a pessary containing cinnamon, saffron, ground almonds, and a pinch of asafoetida. The mixture was boiled, strained through fine muslin, and cooled. A small ball was shaped, wrapped in linen, and stored in olive oil, stirred before bathing, and removed before the next prayer. The recipe advised tying the act of prevention to ritual time. The role of the bathhouse. Women's bathhouses, hammams, are often the only semi-private spaces where such practices could be discussed. Men were not permitted. Midwives, widows, and older matrons, women who had seen 10 pregnancies, 3 miscarriages, and 5 surviving children, acted as de facto experts. You wouldn't call them doctors, but they knew more about what herbs to avoid during breastfeeding than many learnt men did. In the tiled corners of the bath, a woman might whisper, "Don't let your daughter eat fenugreek. It brings milk too soon." Another might say, "If your husband insists tonight, heat some saffron water and drink it before dawn." These were not rebellious acts, nor were they framed as resistance. They were acts of quiet negotiation between the rhythms of marriage, the risks of pregnancy, and the limits of one's own body. It's not just herbs, but timing the cinnamon barrier was often part of a wider practice. Women knew that timing mattered. Certain phases of the moon, days of the menstrual cycle, and even the seasons were thought to influence fertility. A warm spice in the cold months, vinegar rinse after the full moon, a delay until the 5th night. These layers of precaution overlapped, herbal, astronomical, and ritual. A curious traveler's record from 11th century Ray mentions watching women exit a hammam, carrying small pouches of wrapped herbs like charms. The author didn't understand their use, but the phrasing suggests they were not meant for cooking. In homes where women's voices rarely reached the historical record, these pouches may have been among their only tools of agency. Cinnamons. Dual role: desire and defense. Ironically, many of the same herbs used to prevent pregnancy were also aphrodisiacs. Cinnamon increased blood flow. Saffron heightened sensation, more relaxed muscles. These were not cold or punitive solutions. They were meant to allow pleasure without the threat of consequence. Pleasure in moderation was not forbidden. Islam emphasized marital intimacy as a blessing, even a right. The tension came when intimacy brought danger: a womb too full, a body too weak, a family already stretched thin. So the cinnamon barrier became more than just a spice, was a quiet ally helping women navigate desire, risk, and the small freedoms carved into the rhythms of daily life. But how did women pass these recipes on? What happened when one generation forgot, or the ingredients became too expensive, or the bathhouse matron died without sharing her secrets? In the quiet corridors of a hammam in Shiraz, a mother might pass a recipe to her daughter, not with ceremony. But while folding towels or braiding damp hair, "Only use a little," she might say, "or it will burn." The words weren't written. They were woven into the muscle memory of ordinary life. A clove here, a pinch of crushed bark, their measures not by weight but by fingers, intuition, and timing. This was how knowledge survived. Not through ink and parchment, but through whisper and repetition. Through generations of women who lived more by touch than text. Yet this fragile web of oral transmission stretching from the bathhouses of Yazd to the caravanserais of Kerman was deeply rooted in the wider material culture of medieval Iran. And if you follow that thread far enough, it leads outward. 2 ships, markets, and the long spice routes that carried more than just cinnamon. The spices that traveled farther than word cinnamon was not native to Iran. Nor was clove. Nor nutmeg. Nor tamarind. These items traveled great distances from the Malabar coast of India, the island ports of Ceylon, modern Sri Lanka, and the Indonesian archipelago. Caravans carried dried herbs across the mountains of Baluchistan, while Arab dhows unloaded heavy sacks into the ports of Siraf and Hormuz. In the bustling bazaars of Isfahan or Nishapur, you might find cinnamon curls wrapped in waxed linen, priced high enough to be kept under lock and key. These weren't the spices of daily cooking. They were often too expensive for that. Instead, they were hoarded for their medicinal and protective value. Households might keep a pinch hidden in a cloth bundle, reserved for birth, fever, or the days when a woman quietly hoped to delay motherhood just a little longer. Medical texts like Zakairi, Khwarazmshah, the Treasure of the Khwarazmshah, written in Persian by Ismail Gorgani in the 12th century, included long catalogues of herbs and their effects on the womb. Gorgani writes with cautious reverence for cinnamon. It warms the organ, dries the excess, and sharpens the blood. Again, these were medical euphemisms meant to signal contraceptive action without attracting moral condemnation. That careful ambiguity kept the text safe from censure, even as the knowledge passed into kitchens and hammams for very different uses. Passing it on in secret, most women couldn't read medical texts anyway. Literacy among women in medieval Iran varied by region, class, and time, but it was generally low, especially outside the elite circles. So the transmission of contraceptive knowledge was necessarily oral and embodied. A recipe wasn't just told, it was shown. You felt the texture. You smelt the mixture. You watched how it was applied. Sometimes it was given with warnings, only. After your bleeding is stopped. Never on a holy night. Not during fasting. These restrictions weren't just superstitions. They were part of a moral and religious framework that shaped daily life. A woman might trust cinnamon to prevent pregnancy, but she would also recite a verse before applying it or seek a blessing from her grandmother. Physical and spiritual protections were deeply entangled. In rural villages, these practices remained remarkably stable across generations. A mother who had lost 3 infants might tell her daughter not to bear her first child too soon. Wait until the pomegranate tree flowers twice, she might say. And in that time, a pouch of dried herbs would be quietly passed along a cinnamon stick, a clove, some rue, folded in soft cloth and tied with a thread of indigo to keep away the evil eye. The markets behind the medicine behind each cinnamon ball or clove paste was a complex supply chain. Spices were not just exotic commodities. They were among the most regulated goods in the empire. The Seljuk and later the Ilkhanate administrations taxed imports of cinnamon heavily, often storing the most valuable stock in palace warehouses. But smuggling was common. Small traders brought spices inland without permits. Bathhouse keepers sometimes bought their stock from black market sellers, dealers who weren't interested in profit. Margins so much as bartering for favors. Single cinnamon curl might be exchanged for tailoring work, a share of bread, or even an herbal consultation. This murky economy gave women limited but real access to expensive contraceptives. Though cinnamon was never cheap, neither was it wholly inaccessible. A currency of its own, preserved, rationed, treasured, used sparingly. A woman might grind only a tiny portion into oil, stretch it across several weeks of intimate nights, and wrap what was left in a beeswax cloth to keep it fresh. In this way, one stick of cinnamon could become a season's worth of reproductive autonomy, resistance, or resilience. It's tempting to frame these practices as a form of resistance, but that language doesn't quite fit. Most women who used cinnamon-based contraceptives weren't staging revolutions, they were trying to survive. Their choices were not always about empowerment. They were often about recovery, from childbirth, from hunger, from too many pregnancies too close together. Islamic jurisprudence, fiqh, offered some flexibility on these matters. How permanent birth control was debated. Temporary measures like coitus interruptus, azil, or herbal contraceptives were permitted in many schools of thought, especially if both spouses agreed. But this nuance didn't always reach the daily lives of rural or working-class women. So instead, the bathhouse kitchen became their university. The old matron knew which herbs to use. It's the midwife who whispered recipes during massages. The seller who tucked dried cinnamon into the seam of a shawl. These were the professors of a different kind of science, one based on experience, community, and trust. A forgotten pharmacopoeia today. Much of this history is buried not because it was unimportant, but because it was private. Modern researchers must piece it together from scattered sources, footnotes in Arabic treatises, Persian love poetry, court records from family disputes, and oral histories gathered centuries later. One such account, recorded in the 1930s in a rural part of southern Iran, recalls a grandmother who put cinnamon in the oil and said the prayers, and after that, she didn't get heavy with child again. No mention of which prayer, no measurements, just memory. You can sense the erosion of knowledge once central to women's lives, now dimmed by time. What remains are fragments, cinnamon stains on old wooden boxes, spice trails and forgotten trade logs, and poems that hint at secret applications for saffron and clove. But what happened when cinnamon failed? When the oil was too weak, or the recipe forgotten, or the child conceived anyway? Even the best recipes, whispered and guarded, did not always work. Sometimes the oil was too old, or the cinnamon is too weak, or the timing is just not quite right. A woman might go to bed trusting the protection of clove paste or rue infusion, and still feel the stirrings of nausea 2 moons later. In those moments, the cinnamon barrier became a memory, one of soft hopes and fragile power that had simply given way, and in its place came something heavier, a decision. What now? Not a word spoken, but everyone knew a missed period was not announced. It was simply noted by the woman herself, perhaps by her sister or mother. There was no pregnancy test, too. Confirm, only signs, swollen ankles, strange cravings, and the weight of silence growing in the shared rhythm of the hammam. In wealthier homes, a midwife might be summoned quietly, not for birth, but for questions. Have I bled too late? What herbs must I avoid now? But behind these polite inquiries was often a buried plea. Is it still early enough to stop it? In the tightly woven fabric of medieval Iranian communities, midwives acted not only as birth attendants, but as wise women keepers of reproductive secrets. Some carried recipes for cleaning the womb, which they claimed were for after miscarriages, but were often used when a pregnancy had barely begun. These recipes walked a line so fine it blurred into invisibility. They were made from ingredients not foreign or suspicious, but household saffron, bitter almonds, juniper, warm sesame oil, and sometimes vinegar mixed with crushed garlic. Some were inserted, others swallowed. None were advertised. Whether they worked is uncertain. Medieval medical knowledge was full of contradictions, and what worked for one woman might fail another entirely. But what these recipes offered was not certainty, but possibility, a chance, however slim, to shape one's fate again. Moral dilemmas and quiet prayers here, history grows sensitive. The ethics of these practices, what we would now call abortifacients, are tangled in religious, cultural, and personal threads. Medieval Islamic jurists debated the acceptability of abortion, often placing it on a sliding scale. Termination was more permissible before ensoulment, believed to occur at 40, 80, or 120 days, depending on the legal school. After that, abortion was seen as increasingly problematic, except in cases where the mother's life was at risk. But for the women themselves, theology was rarely their first concern. Most weren't asking scholars. They were speaking to other women who had buried infants too soon, or given birth in famine, or bled out alone after their 4th or 5th child. Women who knew that another pregnancy might mean death or ruin, or a child born into a hunger they couldn't survive. So yes, a woman might recite a prayer as she drank the bitter brew, or wash afterwards in rose water, or light a candle and ask for forgiveness. But her decision was rooted in lived experience, not legal doctrine. She might whisper, "God knows I am tired," and hope that was enough. What the midwives knew and what they risked, midwives in medieval Iran walked an uneasy line. Were respected, even honored, but they were also deeply vulnerable. Accusations of misconduct, especially if something went wrong, could lead to shame, banishment, or worse. So midwives guarded their words. They used euphemisms, strengthening the womb or cleansing the blood. If asked directly whether they had induced an abortion, they might reply only, "She bled naturally, God's will." Some worked only with clients they knew well. Others took coins up front, with no promises. If a woman returned not pregnant, no one asked too many questions. If she didn't, the silence grew heavier. In urban areas, some midwives kept coded records lists of herbs and their uses, marked with symbols instead of names. A circle might mean womb, a cross danger, and a diagonal/bleeding. These were their ledgers, not of money, but of knowledge, of caution, of care. In rural areas, there were no books, only memory, muscle, and prayer. Regret, relief, and what came after. Some women wept afterward. Others went back to work. There was no ceremony, no public mourning, only the quiet return to life, to spinning wool, grinding millet, and nursing older children. In some cases, women who had used cinnamon or saffron to prevent or end a pregnancy would later become caretakers to orphan nieces or ailing parents. Life was never still. The responsibilities didn't stop, and in that motion, perhaps the pain softened, but regret was real. Medieval Persian poetry is full of verses about the ambiguity of motherhood, its burdens, its sweetness, its dangers. In one anonymous verse, preserved in a Shirazi manuscript, a woman writes, "I drank the saffron oil in shadow, but still I see his face in sleep." Whether this refers to a child never born or a child lost later is unclear, but the tone is unmistakable. Not shame, but sorrow. And yet for every poem of regret, there were stories of relief. Women who survived childbirth because they delayed it. Of mothers who could feed the children they already had. Of girls who reached adulthood without being wed too young because their mothers had bought them just a little more time. In this quiet calculus of risk and care, cinnamon played a small but potent role, not as a cure-all, not as a rebellion, but as a tool of balance. The cinnamon barrier, not perfect, but powerful by the end of the 15th century, more medical. Texts began to include explicit contraceptive recipes, some drawn from earlier Persian, Arabic, and even Greek sources. These texts didn't mark a change in women's knowledge. They simply caught up with it, and still, cinnamon remained. It persisted through dynasties, through plagues, through invasions, because it was simple, because it was sacred, because it offered something rare in a world full of uncertainty, a choice, however fragile. Today you can find cinnamon bark in spice markets in Tehran and Tabriz. It sits beside modern pills and pamphlets, in clinics and shops. Most who buy it do so for flavor, for fragrance, for memory. But somewhere, perhaps still in a quiet village bathhouse, or in the whispered recipe of a grandmother, the old use is not forgotten.